Welcome to Windows on the World. I think we're live now. Just let me know if we're live, if I'm live. I think so. All the evidence seems to point that way. I'll just look into the chat. Okay, great. I'll carry on as I mean to. And we're going to talk tonight a little bit about catastrophism, uniformitarianism, the plague of the celestial gods, but more importantly, what it means philosophically, how that we can adapt to sudden and rapid change. And of course, we saw that over the past 5 years. And how did we actually adapt to the psychological aspects of the change? That's really what this thing is all about. So in a way, it doesn't matter whether we're approaching the time of a comet hitting the Earth or a psychological operation. It really is about how we adapt to it. That's if we survive, of course. And we're also going to be looking at the allegory and truth behind the Atlantis myth. And I was talking a little bit about that on the Richie Allen show today. So if you did listen to that, we are going to be covering a lot of different material. So we're going to be talking really about exactly how this fits into the present. And we've got an interesting situation at the moment where we have the introduction of massive arrested development. And I was watching a show on Sunday that I did in 2013, and it's called Forced Evictions. And I put it into the chat really because it made me think. When we did that show, we had some great people on there who were finding out exactly how the court system worked. In other words, they were bringing remedies to systems which were in place, which the public didn't know about. In other words, that court cases were being held in private. They were unlisted. They were being done in the county court. The county court was being used to take property by government agencies and private companies. And the way out of this was to go to the High Court. I learned all about these procedures, and they're actually quite easy, but they're not available to the public. And of course, we are only fed enough knowledge to keep us in the system. So the whole idea of an advanced civilization would be to actually gain knowledge and be able to survive both psychological and real cataclysms and be able to carry on. And that was the subject of the Lost Order of Knowledge, which was a group of shows we did. And we talked about this concept that the ancient Druids and really the ancient Christian culture of the British Isles survived because they had small cells of people who could actually carry on when and if a cataclysm happened. And there's a very interesting documentary attached to that particular article, and it's called The Last Druid. And it really talks about this advanced ancient civilization of the British Isles and Ireland. And to me, it puts a lot of things into perspective. When I looked at the work of William Comyns Beaumont, it took me a long time to accept his theories, which are of catastrophism. We're going to go into that also tonight and carry that on from the previous shows that we've done. So yes, interesting point also is, how do people remove themselves from technocracy and actually become more, I don't like that word intuitive, I think it's been rather debased, but more aware, more aware. I'll give you an example of something which is both ancient and new. On the 11th of March 2020, I was sat there in this mobile home by the seaside, and I'd been away for weeks. I hadn't been in this place. And about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I was watching this Sky News nonsense about the COVID agenda, which was just about to be launched. And there was a noise at the door. And this crow, I think it was actually a baby raven. I actually identified it a few days later, but this glass door was being attacked by this crow. And it was furiously trying to get my attention. And it came back at dawn every day for 5 days. And in ancient times, that would have probably been seen as a warning, whereas in modern times, we brush it off. But what was it? Well, actually, I thought it was some kind of warning. And I thought something big's coming here. And I'd been thinking about this for a number of years because obviously the idea of using a pandemic to control people is a very old one. And it was quite extraordinary. I was thinking of posting the video, but I never actually got round to it. But in a way, the last few shows I've been talking about when you go back to nature and what you actually connect with, how you connect with the surroundings, for instance. And I also mentioned on that last live stream about the meteorites that came down in the mountain where I'm staying. I was staying right in the wilderness. So it's very interesting, all this. And I think that people have become so urbanized and the technocracy has got them so much, and we're all guilty of it, that we spend time scrolling through this nonsense, but not focusing on what's really important. I know that sounds very, very basic to most people, but it's actually something that I think is important because it's about reattuning. And the more you reattune, the more I think you can get in touch with reality, true reality. And that's really what these ancient civilizations seem to be doing. The more I've read about them, the more that type of thing was very important to them. So yeah, it's whether we see warnings and prophecies in things. I think that's quite an interesting thing, really, because once you attune yourself to it and start really being more aware, then these things do seem to be signals that you can get. It's basically just the way reality operates, and I find that incredibly important and interesting. And it was one of the things that really got me into looking at ancient civilizations. Actually, I'm not talking about following tarot readers and astrologers and all that sort of thing. I'm talking about just like being more in tune. And it's something I've noticed over the past few years because I lived in London for about 24, 25 years. And I was doing gigs every weekend. I was out all the time in London. And I realized that it's a decision that you make. And all of a sudden, I prefer being in the wilderness. And some people can't sort of make that bridge. They say, oh, I'd miss my friends and all this sort of thing. So all of this is about adaptation. And that is really what catastrophism and the idea of sudden and rapid change is all about. And I was just thinking the other day, what a long, strange trip it's been, even with the Wonders on the World shows, the stuff we've covered. And it goes back such a long way. But when we think about it and we put it in perspective of time and look at our lives, I find this very fascinating because I get flashbacks now and I get memories of things that I didn't know that I could remember, events that have happened. And it's like an overview. And I think a lot of this is about when you get back in touch with your own focus. Very important stuff, very simple, I know, but I think it's quite good, you know. And it's what is really philosophically useful. What's philosophically useful to you? Is it looking at the same news cycle every day, which I know I used to get into, or is it actually managing your time properly? Because I think with the speeding up of time and the way we're metabolizing time, and that is a known fact that the Schumann resonance goes up and down, which is the Earth's electrical pulse, this low electrical pulse, and there's this telluric energy in the ground, which obviously we pick up on. And of course, there's this concept that if we live in cities, we get sort of isolated from that. But that was, to me, one of the most important things about looking back at these ancient civilizations, how they attuned themselves and what their values were more than anything, because it's more to do with how a civilization degenerates. So we've got this idea of these four stages, like demoralization, where the population becomes demoralized. Then we have a thing called destabilization. Then a crisis happens. And it could be a number of crises. And after the crisis comes a thing called normalization. So it's like a form of abuse. In other words, any form of normality is better than the crisis. And people will accept inhibition on their rights, which happened after the COVID incident, obviously. And it was interesting to see how many people became more forceful about enforcing the communitarian ideals on each other. And I've always said that it's the public that I'm more concerned about, not what the globalists are doing, because we know what they're doing and it's kind of degenerating. But the way through it all to me is the most important thing. So yes, it's what's philosophically useful. And what came across to me by watching that show about the law, the forced eviction show, was that the law system is so degenerate, especially in the UK. In fact, it's very, very corrupt, and it's beyond what most people would believe unless they get wrapped up in it. So we have to consider all these things and say, okay, so they're degenerating everything for what purpose? For plunder, for usury, and for control and management of population. But then what? That's the important thing. What happens after that point? So the idea of this ancient civilization that got wiped out, well, there's probably been many because there's been many cataclysms on the earth, was that people would form small groups, small cells, and they would have skills that could be used to rebuild or to carry on. And that is why the oral culture was so important, because people wanted to be able to carry around their history in their heads. Just think about that. That's a remarkable concept, isn't it? Because when I go traveling, I don't really take anything. I usually take a laptop with me, and that takes up most of the space in the bag, and anything else I usually buy when I get there. So I travel light. But this is the idea that how prepared are you for what's coming? Because to be fully prepared, you have to be able to say, right, I'm going. It's a very interesting thing just to test yourself, I think, philosophically. So yes, we've talked about the lost order of knowledge and the ancient Druidic and Celtic civilizations of Britain. And this indicates that there was a very advanced situation in the British Isles way before the Romans turned up. And of course, we're given the 597 AD when St. Augustine turned up and converted Ethelbert into being a Christian. Well, Christianity had already started. So when we look at history, we have to look at who wrote it. And we're looking at Roman history. And when we look at the works of people like William Comyns Beaumont and Ignatius Donnelly, we see that they're pointing to a much more advanced civilization. For instance, the first church in Britain was in Glastonbury, 30 AD. We covered that in a show called Albion's Apostles, about Joseph of Arimathea visiting Britain with Jesus and then returning after the crucifixion. And this is very credible, and there is a lot of evidence to support it. So when we're looking at history, we have to really look at what is the most probable outcome. That's what I was really talking about on Richie Allen's show today, and the degeneration of social Darwinism, the social engineers of the 17 and 1800s, Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Lyell, who believed that if they could disprove the stories in the Bible, then the right of kingship, the divine right of kingship, could be abolished. So we're talking about a massive social engineering concept here. And it's really not taken them that long when you think about it, if we look at the situation over thousands of years. And I think that's what we have a problem with, because we think in terms of our own short lives, don't we? So yes, the idea is that people are going to become functioning biorobots. Well, the idea, of course, is to not do that. And we did a show called The Force They Fear, which was about the power and spirituality that was there in the early Christian times. And it was believed that the whole purpose of Freemasonry was to destroy this spiritual power. So I also talked about that today on Richie's show. We talked about the idea that we are up against a very powerful force, but that force can be very easily defeated. It's again about the level of infiltration that people will handle. And a small amount of infiltration will lead to more infiltration and then degeneration. And then we get the system that we have now, which is completely degenerated. So when we talk about Comyns Beaumont, we talk about first of all, a mysterious comet, and that was March the 17th, 1322 BC. And this comet, Beaumont worked out, actually hit a part of Scotland. It hit an area around Fingal's Cave and spread out. And this resulted in people actually spreading out from Britain. And this, he states, explains a lot of different cultures which were all related. So, for instance, he thinks that the Ur of the Chaldees, which is in modern day Iraq, were greatly influenced by what happened in the north. And when I started looking at this, I thought it sounds a bit colonial or something. But when I looked into it, he gave so many good reasons for this. So that has been the subject of quite a lot of our early shows. And we're going to get into some quotes. I'd like to give you some quotes to get you into the next stage of this visitation into the catastrophism of authors such as William Comyns Beaumont. And if we look at the mysterious comet, we have a quote in there, and it's about the island of Iona. 7 years before the end of the world, a deluge shall drown the nations. The sea at one tide shall cover Erin and the green-clad Islay, but Columba's Isle shall swim above the flood. That was written by Thomas Pennant in his tour of Scotland, if you want to know. But what we were getting at really was that the kings and princes were influenced in their choice of Iona by a strange prophecy relating to the destruction of the world and a flood from which Iona would emerge unscathed. So it's fascinating once we start looking into this ancient history. And Beaumont maintains that a huge landmass was sunk and that the islands such as the Hebrides were the remnants of that. And it spread out a very long way. So we were attached to the Scandinavian peninsula, which is quite obvious when you look at it. And then we get Doggerland, which goes right down to the side of the British Isles. And that is known to be a place that existed with a civilization there. So the idea that there was an advanced civilization that spread out is actually, I think, quite credible. I'm going to give you a quote here because a lot of people are still stuck within the uniformitarian model. And this is from Professor Bickerton. And it was in the Daily Mail, June the 4th, 1927. And he said, optimists who imagined that we should suffer no ill effects from a collision with the head of a comet would receive a shock if such a thing actually occurred, as not one of them would be left to tell the tale. And he was actually dismissed from his post. And such is the power of the uniformitarian view. So if we apply this to the present technocracy, which keeps people as functioning biorobots, or that is the aim, to take away any form of individuality and keep them hooked up to the internet, the unreal world, and keep them chained in there. Well, this is really what the whole of the technocracy is all about. And when we look at things like artificial intelligence, it will never actually be able to replace sentience. So they then say that computers are sentient. Well, of course they're not sentient because they don't have that awareness. They don't have that awareness which you have when you wake up and you're aware that you're there. They are just machine learning devices, basically, crap in, crap out, or decent data in, decent data out, but no sentience. And of course, this is missed by the technocrats because they've lost that ability to be creative. And I think this is the great challenge of the times. So Beaumont says the world was never the same after the deluge. The only argument is which one we were talking about, or were the legends all talking about the same one that started on March the 17th, 1322 BC. Now, he comes up with that date in the mysterious comet with a lot of evidence because Beaumont was actually a meteorologist. Now, if you look up meteorology now, or meteorism as it's called, then it's something to do with indigestion. So even that's been written out of history. But of course, we have the World Meteorological Office. So we're still using the term. So I'm going to give you the title of Beaumont's books in case you're interested, because we have covered them quite a lot. His first book was called The Riddle of the Earth in 1925. His second book was called The Mysterious Comet, published in 1932, and followed by The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain in 1945, which was followed by Britain, the Key to World History in 1948. And then a lost document was found by Ingrid McLean of ResonanceBookworks.com, and it was called The Great Deception. And that puts all of Beaumont's books into perspective. Now, what I would say is that when you read his stuff for the first time, it's very overwhelming, and I would say quite confusing, but it's worth sticking with. And when you look at the vast amount of information in there, then it explains an awful lot about Britain being an advanced civilization way before the Romans. He even looks at the roads that were there before the Romans that they claimed for themselves. So when we look at the Roman civilization, they actually claimed authorship for a lot of things that weren't theirs. So they were, in a way, a bit like cuckoos. They came in and they took over existing civilizations, which they then called Roman. And when I look at the ancient history of Europe, that is absolutely obvious. As of course, much history has been wiped out, especially in Central Eastern Europe and countries that were communist or countries that were under Ottoman rule. And this is for hundreds of years. So there is a huge amount of history that's completely gone, which is why it's very important, I think, to keep history alive. And that is what the purpose of these shows really is about, in that if and when something does happen, and if society just does collapse into arrested development, then there will be people who can still at least talk about these things and move forward, because that to me is the most important thing, being able to actually keep learning, because this is, after all, a lifelong learning project that we're on. And at the moment, that's degenerating. So it's a choice, isn't it? Do you go with the degeneration? Do you allow that to get to you? Or do you go the other way and say, I'm going to be part of this new civilization? It's kind of choice. I find it an interesting one, personally. Yes, so we've talked about the lost order of knowledge and Druidism. The Ancient Faith of Britain was another book that we covered. And this is by Dudley Wright, and it was written in 1920. And he said this about the Druidic priests. The ruler of the universe, in the discharge of his office, was assisted by subordinate divinities who were supposed to act rather as angels or messengers than as possessed of any inherent authority of their own. So, in other words, the priest class were chosen because they had perception, not because they had authority. Very interesting concept, that, isn't it? And it reverses what we see today. The trained agents of change with their sound bites and their lies and their disingenuous waffle. That would never have happened in an advanced civilization. Even if we go back to ancient Greece, some of the trials that have happened, the miscarriages of justice that we've seen in Britain, would not have happened, say, in ancient Greece, because everything had to be reenacted and then analysed and talked about. Whereas what the police can do is they can bring a case to the CPS, they can make it meet the threshold, they can control all of the information that goes into the court, they can destroy and discard as much of the defence as they want, and this is done with the complicity of the CPS and is directed by the judge. So when we talk about this system, we have to realize that it is pretty much 100% degenerated now. And that's a very interesting point, that the priesthood were just receivers of divinity. They were not administering a strict form of justice. And that is, I think, the key to a civilization where people generally know how to behave and they're not pushed into illegal acts through societal pressure, such as usury. Very important point. So if civilization is going to rebuild, the plunder and the usury would have to go. So these are points from William Comyns Beaumont. He said, I believe that the ancient world, or rather the highest placed of that time, were made aware in advance of impending disaster, or an impending disaster known as the flood, and that they took steps beforehand to prepare a means of escape. So this ties in to what we were talking about in the lost order of knowledge, in that there were warnings and people acted accordingly. People who knew acted accordingly, which is why we have this proliferation of dolmens and what they call passage graves. Because dolmens, as we've stated before, are not graves. They have huge capstones supported by other stones. And those capstones can be up to 100 tons. You wouldn't put a stone 3 foot thick as a roof on a grave, would you? You'd put one that was about 6 inches thick or something like that. So when we look at the spread out of dolmens, they did seem to spread out from the northern hemisphere, and they go as far as North Korea. It's quite amazing. And the more you look into this, I would say the more sense that it makes. So Beaumont also talks about the enigma of raised beaches, some of them over 1,000 foot above mean sea level. And this is also covered in the mysterious comet. So he brings out an enormous amount of anomalies and also a lot of examples. So I'm going to read now from the mysterious comet, page 21. The practical importance of meteorism as the science concerned with the origin, growth, and future existence of our Earth cannot be overstated. It is no academic subject, for the human race are dependent on it for their well-being or otherwise. It is true that mankind is powerless to divert in any way these messengers of the Almighty, but they can often take steps to escape from a threatened region. I believe that the ancient world, or rather the highest placed of that time, were made aware in advance of the impending disaster. So, in The Great Deception, which was Beaumont's last work, which was only recently published, he goes on to talk about how Christianity was relocated in the Middle East from what became the British Isles. And if you go to an article called Britain's Shattered Isles, you will get the whole story of that from the comet of 1322 BC onwards and what happened. And then the Roman cover story of Constantine in 325 AD relocating the Christianity of the North into the Middle East. And that is something which is very hard to get your head around unless you actually think about it. And if you think about it, it does start to make sense. So, yes, that was the whole purpose of the Great Deception, the relocation of history due to a cataclysm. And I did say we're going to get onto Atlantis. So we did talk about the Atlantis story in a show called Atlantis. And I've got some things I wrote down earlier here. And it was Timaeus who said, one day and night after an earthquake, Atlantis disappeared to the sea. It was greater than Africa and Asia. So we're talking about a huge continent. And what Beaumont contends, and Ignatius Donnelly to an extent, I think, is that this idea of Atlantis, of course, was in the Atlantic Ocean, and it was in the Northern Hemisphere. And that is something that they kind of agree on. Tertullian stated Atlantis was real and equal in size to Libya or Asia. Just giving you some quotes here. In the 1600s, Atlantis was, of course, relocated to the New World. And then, of course, we get books like The New Atlantis by Manly P. Hall. And, of course, previously, Francis Bacon had talked about the New Atlantis and even wrote a book about that. So this idea that Atlantis was in the Northern Hemisphere was something that was carried on by many authors. And as an aside, the word utopia is a term invented by Sir Thomas More in his work of the same name about America. So in other words, people who went to America and started it were the original Atlanteans. That is the concept that they're talking about. So Ignatius Donnelly's book, 1882, it was published, Atlantis. He said that, along with Comins Beaumont, that the great flood of the Bible, and there were two floods in the Bible that seem to be referred to two floods, that the flood of Ogyges, the flood of Deucalion in Greek mythology were the same flood. The only thing that is up for debate is when this happened. And Beaumont contends that the timelines are quite a few hundred years out. Now, that could make sense when you think about it. Of course, all of this is just circumstantial. But when we look at the geological record, as Beaumont did, then I think there's a lot more in it. So yes, and this is again what Plato stated, that the Atlantis disappeared after an earthquake lasting 1 day and night. And this you can read on page 280 of The Mysterious Comet. And Beaumont says, to us, the effect of these bodies, great or small, leads to tragic sufferings, to enormous financial losses, and to inclement weather. Yet if this interplanetary contact were to be non-existent, there can be little doubt that life would before long be blotted out, so that the very greatest catastrophes are really blessings in disguise. Although it may be that large numbers of human beings are in the event sacrificed for the common weal of the remainder. I have often believed that this philosophy lay behind the custom of the ancients to offer human sacrifices, in the belief that the deity, Saturn or Baal, or other such gods required to be propitiated with human lives. Now, Beaumont also goes into the Saturnian cult, and I did a few shows on that. And this is another aspect where it ties in very much with the Saturn cult and the idea that the planets were in different positions. And that goes into this idea that Venus, Mars, and Saturn were in a conjunction. And I've been reading a lot of stuff recently, and this goes a lot deeper than many people might think. There's actually the Saturn theory is an article at windowsontheworld.net, and you can have a look at that. I did a whole show on it. But this idea that people's beliefs were formed by these comets in the sky, because as I was saying a couple of weeks ago, when you see even meteorites or shooting stars, as they're called, they're pretty distinct and very mystical looking in the sky. So you can imagine thousands of years ago, if a comet turned up that was going out of control, it would have horns on it. And this is all to do with the gaseous quality of the comet, which is made up of a huge amount of debris. And these things were massive. So they would have been seen as celestial gods. And there would have been a need to appease the celestial gods so they didn't turn up again. Of course, we covered that in the Celestial Gods show, Plague of the Celestial Gods. And we also have this idea of the antediluvian world. And this is in Ignatius Donnelly's book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. He talks of the three worlds, which are represented by the trident of Poseidon and the trident of Neptune. Of course, Neptune, king of the sea. And then he gives some very good references which go into the Bhagavata Purana, which is believed to have been written 800 to 1000 AD, although they don't really know. And it stated, after 7 days, the waters of the flood were upon the world. And it's a reference to the three kingdoms of Atlantis in Ignatius Donnelly's book of the same name. And yes, so this idea of Atlantis, it became a sort of popular allegory for all lost civilizations. So the Atlantis myth has carried on, and it's been used up until the time of Madame Blavatsky and then Annie Besant into the New Age, into Theosophy, into Steiner. They all got into this idea. I would say that that was a very corrupted version of the original idea, having covered Blavatsky. There's a really good show we did about Blavatsky. It's called The Miracle Club, about how her and her partner at the time in the Theosophical Society were getting up to all sorts of adventures. And it's great theatre, but it detracts slightly from the seriousness of the subject we're talking about here. And yes, so Beaumont does maintain that Britain is a metaphor for Atlantis. It was a once civilized and advanced civilization, and it spiraled into decline, or is now spiraling once again into decline through degenerating principles of governance. And of course, the way that we are governed indicates where the society is at. So there is no way that anyone can deny that the governance we have is degenerative. Yes, and we have very good quotes from many sources, including the first century AD. Timagenes quoted by, this is Timagenes, who was the author, he was quoted by Ammianus Messallinus in the 4th century. So it was during the time of the Romans. He said the Druids of Gaul had migrated from distant lands in the north. So the Gallic Druids said that they came from the north and migrated into Gaul. And we are told that the head of the training of the Druids was in Gaul. But conversely, we are told that the main Druidic strongpoints were in the British Isles, including the Isle of Anglesey, the Isle of which is known as Mona, of course, or was known as Mona, the Isle of Wight, and the Isle of Man. These were Druidic strongholds. And it was stated in the book The Druids, which we covered in our show, Druids and Ancient Civilization. This was the one written in 1924, Druids and Ancient Britain, that the training places for the Druids were in Britain, in the oak groves. And these places of training were not temples. To me, that's a sign also of quite an advanced culture, because the need for temple and ritual and man-made law is always coincident with degeneration. So think about that. Think about what's happened over the past 2,000 years. So the Druids did not have temples of initiation. They used oak groves. So they used natural surroundings, no pomp, no circumstance, no ritual priesthood, no Pharisees, no archbishops. They had a hierarchy, but that hierarchy was there because of their knowledge, not because of their assumed authority. And talking about recent events, we actually covered the Martinique disaster of 1908. And this was when the volcano erupted and the people wanted to leave this area, but they were kept there by the military and they all died, the Martinique disaster. And this is also covered by Beaumont, along with several others, including the Tunguska incident. We need to go back to the Coon Butte crater in Arizona. Then we can go forward to this Tunguska incident, which was 2013. And there is a massive impact in Siberia. And it didn't really do that much devastation, but places were wiped out. So these things are not uncommon at all. And if we look at history of Britain, I'm going random here because we've covered so much on this subject, so I'll go a bit freestyle. This is Roman London by Gordon Home. That's the book. There was a great gap during which all traces of streets were obliterated under a vast accumulation of ruin and subsequent vegetable deposit. And Beaumont suggests this could have been the result of a tidal wave coming down the Thames. Well, even with today's Thames barrier, something of any magnitude would not be held back. If you've ever seen the Thames barrier, you'll know what I mean. So these events are scattered and not properly recorded or understood, but they are there in the geological record, which again goes against the idea of uniformitarianism, that the Earth has remained relatively stable over thousands of years, and this is seen in the geological record. Well, in fact, it's not when we dig a little deeper. So, yeah, interesting stuff. I'm going to read now from T.W. Rolleston in Myths and Legends of the Celtic Race. In seeking the dolmen builders, we trace a line diagonally across Europe from the Varanga Fjord, which is at the top of the Gulf of Bothnia in Scandinavia, to the mouth of the Rhone. And it shows that with very few exceptions, and those were mainly in Italy, Corsica, and Sardinia, they were the ones that spread out. All the dolmens are placed to the north or the west of that line. And that is very interesting because Beaumont suggests through his studies of meteorism that comets eventually, when they go out of control and they don't go towards the sun and burn up, when they break their orbit and go out of control, and it must be very frightening. They look like serpents in the sky darting around in this kind of crazy dance in the sky. That what happens is that they are attracted by this geological law of attraction to volcanoes, and they travel in a northeast southwest direction. So he gives lots of examples of comets that have done this, the ones, of course, which have impacted the Earth. So I'm going to quote now from Signor Angelo Mosso. This is a work called The Dawn of Mediterranean Civilization. Also traces the paths or movements of the dolmen builders from the British Isles to Brittany, along the Rhone Valley to Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica and Italy, thence to Algeria and Morocco, whilst another path from Brittany followed the present Atlantic coast to Spain and then across to Morocco. And if you want to have a look at a really huge dolmen in Spain, look at the Menga dolmen, M-E-N-G-A, and tell me that that's not some kind of shelter. It's like a reinforced bomb shelter inside. So it appears from these authors, from this research, that a catastrophe happened in the northern hemisphere, and Beaumont states that it happened in the place now called the British Isles and spread out. And as a result of that, the advanced civilization that had been on this landmass also spread out. And that would explain why dolmens then went all over the world, as I said, as far as North Korea and India. And we also have to remember that the Indus Valley civilization was wiped out. Nobody knows where they went. So that's another fascinating thing. So when we're talking about lost civilizations, we are talking about civilizations that were literally lost. Yeah. Yes. So when we're talking about dolmens, we have them in China, North Korea, Tamil Nadu in India, Karnataka in Africa, and also along the Jordan Rift Valley, Upper Galilee in Israel, the Golan Heights, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Turkey. So we're spreading out here. And India in the Pandavara Beta, which has more than 50 dolmens. So something must have happened there at some point, or people must have gone there and took this dolmen building with them. You have to take your pick on that one because we don't know. The official story with dolmens is that they were put there by ancient farming civilizations or communities about 3 to 5,000 years ago. And so that these primitive people who were farmers would lug these massive stones, sometimes 100 tons, into the middle of a field and hoist them up and then stick legs on them for the purpose of burying somebody. Doesn't make any sense, although the later dolmens and the long barrows were found to have bones inside. But if you visit any of these things, they look like bomb shelters. And also, when I've traveled around Central Eastern Europe, the so-called Thracian tombs, the ones that have been rebuilt, because most of them have actually decayed, they kind of rebuild them. But when you look at what the original size and shape of them, they don't really look like tombs. They again look like shelters. This is all a supposition, but it makes more sense in the long term of history. So yes, this is another point as well about the British Isles. A fellow called Polydore Virgil, in his history dated 1538, stated that the Isle of Man is now remote from the land by 23 miles, which in old times was only 1 mile from Anglesey and joined onto Wales. That's interesting, isn't it? Because when we think of these druidic outposts of the Isle of Man, Mona, Anglesey, and the Isle of Wight, and we think of the submerged continent of Atlantis or the northern European landmass area, starts to make sense. So, yeah, I've got a lot of quotes here, but we've been going quite a long time. Yes, fascinating stuff. He also talks about the drift age, the ice age, and how improbable it is that the official story happened. And hopefully we'll get into that in future times. So I'll just have a quick look at the comments because I've been going like for ages now. Who are the humans so afraid of? Well, we've already said the sky gods, the celestial gods would have been one of the things that would have terrified people thousands of years ago, and indeed would do so again. So yeah, back then, question mark. Well, we're talking about a comet that hit this greater landmass in the northern hemisphere, 1322 BC, according to Comins Beaumont, but that's just his theory. Of course, it's open to debate, but the geological record which he brings forward in The Mysterious Comet and The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain is very convincing indeed and extraordinarily detailed. So yeah, just to answer those questions. Interesting stuff. Yeah, it is interesting stuff, isn't it? I mean, this is the thing with these live streams. How far can you go with it with a live stream that lasts an hour or so? You can just throw information out. The idea of these is really that people can go away and look at it and think, there might be something in this, and then bring their own research in, because that's the whole point of the lifelong learning project, is that people will send me information, and that's happening all the time. So the whole idea of this is to expand knowledge, and expanding knowledge is good for the mind. And I think that anybody on here can relate to that. The stuff that's out there and what's happening is, conversely, we've got this illusion of choice, but there is so much mediocrity and monotony within that so-called choice. So stepping outside that into a much bigger picture is what these shows are all about. Yeah. Yes, there's some great stuff here, but I don't think I'll put it in. So yes, I want to leave you possibly with this quote, and it's from one of our recent shows, and I think it was in Plague of the Celestial Gods. It was published on June the 9th, 2017, and the source was space.com, and it was authored by somebody called Mike Wall. And he says, quote, "Life on Earth may not have been possible without comet strikes. A new study suggests that about 20% of the noble gas xenon in Earth's atmosphere was delivered by comets long ago. And these icy wanderers likely brought lots of other stuff to our planet as well," researchers have said. The cometary contribution could have been significant for organic matter, especially prebiotic material, and could have contributed to shape the cradle of life on Earth. Now, this is very fascinating, because it goes into the panspermia theories of Fred Hoyle, which were actually rejected, that life could have actually come to Earth, or things that were not on Earth already could have arrived on comets. And then there's the other side of it. Could comets have brought plague and disaster? Because there is information out there which does suggest that this could have been the case. And it's very interesting, isn't it, when we look at the so-called Black Death in Europe and the places where plague happened, and you think, well, how did this spread to such remote areas? Because the idea was that it was spread on the fleas of rats, and it got sort of carted around in like rolls of material. This is how it was meant to have spread throughout parts of England, for instance. But what about the concept that it was actually on the back of something that just landed? All this stuff is very possible, and I try not to confuse it all too much, but I hope I've given you a little more of an overview if you're actually new to the subject. And yes, we can talk about the um, the Tunguska impact, which was the largest Earth impact in recorded history. On June the 30th, 1908, an asteroid plunged into Earth's atmosphere and exploded in the skies over Siberia. Local eyewitnesses in this sparsely populated region reported seeing a fireball and hearing a large explosion. They also reported massive forest fires and trees blown over for miles because of the remoteness of the site. And it wasn't really reported much because it was inside Tsarist Russia and in a very remote area. So this is fascinating. They're now telling us that we're going to be hit by another asteroid around 2032. And it's been in the news recently. It's kind of coincided with all the stuff I've been putting out about Comins Beaumont recently on the live streams, which is very interesting. So, yes, when we talk about the difference between uniformitarianism and catastrophism, it's like the establishment versus anti-establishment. And we've got to remember, of course, what the Roman Church did to people who stepped outside of their narrative. Nothing has changed because the new climate catastrophobia is, of course, enforced as a religion. So the religions of the past would have been influenced by these celestial bodies coming out of the sky and a rearrangement or different arrangement of planets. And this is something that Velikovsky talked about, worlds in collision, which many people now, not just a few, believe was taken from the works of William Comins Beaumont, who has been written out of history, which is why I like to talk about him. Because even when we talk about Beaumont in the live streams, he doesn't show up underneath. All the other people we talk about will show up, but he doesn't, which is quite interesting, isn't it? So Beaumont, to sum it up, thinks that there was an advanced civilization in the Northern Hemisphere, and the British Isles was central to this advanced civilization. And this after the catastrophe of 1322 BC, this civilization spread out, and it went through Europe, and it spread out to many different places. And he maintains that, for instance, the Ur of the Chaldees, which is in modern day Iraq, were part of this exodus. Now, some of this people will have difficulty with believing, and I'm not asking anybody to believe anything I say. It's just an area of research which seems to resonate, seems to make sense, and seems to tie in with what's happening at the moment, in that we are at the end of a civilization. But this does not mean that it is the end of civilization. In other words, it's a very optimistic view in that these things have been survived before, whether it's a psychological cataclysm of the mind or a real cataclysm, then there will be survivors. And how are we prepared to carry on? And what will make us carry on? certainly not usury, land piracy, and plunder. So that's just something to think about. I hope you enjoyed that. I was going to get into a bit more, but I think I've been going for quite a long time. So thanks for listening, and do stay in touch through the website. I'd like to let you know about the way to contact me. It's info@windowsontheworld.net. And thanks to everybody who does send in information. So great. I'm glad you enjoyed that. What is the name of Beaumont? It's William Comyns Beaumont. And his books are available, resonancebookworks.com. If you go onto the internet, just put in William Comyns Beaumont, you put in The Mysterious Comet, The Riddle of Prehistoric Britain, The Great Deception, The Riddle of the Earth, his books will come up. So great. That was most illuminating. Well, I'm very glad to hear that, because the whole idea of it is to be illuminating and to be inspiring, because the last thing I want to do is sit here talking about the news cycle. That was why I was looking at doing a show on the law on Sunday, and I will do that show. But the amount of knowledge that we had all those years ago, and the amount of progress that was being made and really winning, to quote common law Malcolm. In fact, a lot of these so-called truthers now are using that phrase, which I coined many years ago, but it was the irony of it all. So I invented common law Malcolm, because obviously the new remedy gurus are advocating a lot of stuff that not only doesn't work, but is guaranteed to get you in a lot of trouble. But the most important thing is that whatever system you're in, there's always a way around it. How do you think people got around communism? Because they appeared to do one thing, but then did another. So this is the challenge of the current times, isn't it? So thanks for watching, everybody. And I'll be back again. It should be next Sunday, 8 p.m. GMT. And I will upload some of the Spreaker shows, because none of those over the past 4 years have really ended up on YouTube. So there's 400 and odd shows in the Spreaker archive on the live shows page at windowsontheworld.net. We also have an Odyssey channel, and the links to that are on the homepage at windowsontheworld.net. If you'd like to help out Windows on the World, you can do that on the homepage also, or info@windowsontheworld.net to join the £5 a month club, because I want to make some more films and keep carrying on doing this. And the assistance I get and the information I get from the listeners is what keeps me going. So thanks very much, and see you soon. I'm going to read through the comments.